Okay, so picking up where we left off in class today, just again to talk about the expenses of the war. So we already highlighted these 3 points that the war was incredibly expensive. About $300 billion was spent, which was 10 times more than the cost of World War One, and twice as much as all previous spending since 1776. So if you took everything the United States government spent from the July 4th Declaration of Independence until World War One, and you doubled that. That's how much was spent with the Second World War. And another statistic there: at the height of the war efforts, the war was costing the American people $10 million an hour. So again, this is a very, very expensive endeavor that took place during the course of the 1940s. So the question is, how do we pay for this whole thing? How do we finance it? So Roosevelt, as the president, would have preferred a pay-as-you-go option, meaning that the United States government had the resources and would have paid for it while it was happening. Although, at $300 billion, that cost was just way too great to do that. So there's one way of doing that. You do that through taxes. So the income tax was expanded and the rate rose to as high as 90% on the wealthiest Americans. So at that point in time, you increase your tax base, you increase how much the rates are going to go up to pay for this. And for the first time in United States history, income tax becomes the main source of revenue. So the income tax amendment had been passed in the 19 teens. And finally now, by World War II, income tax becomes the main source of income for the United States government, which again it is today. 2/5 of all spending of the war were paid for what the United States government was currently bringing in through the taxes. The other was borrowed. And so the national debt of the United States skyrocketed during that time. And this graph then that's coming up, so this graph shows just how much that national debt increased during the course of the wartime efforts. So if we look at 1932, that would have been right before the Great Depression there. The national debt was $19 billion. It went up to $42 billion just before we went into World War II, which is roughly, a $23 trillion increase. The first 2 years of the war, 42 to 72, it only increases by $30 trillion. Again, remembering, keeping in mind that World War II really doesn't start for the United States until right about this point. And then look at how much it jumps. In just 2 years' time, it's more than double, and then it goes even at the peak of the war, right before the war, right as the war ends, we're almost at $300 billion in debt. So the United States national government debt increased significantly during the course of the war, and the debt issues that we had during the war obviously become something that we continue to talk about even to this day. So let's talk about how the money was actually accumulated by the United States government. The big form of debt was war bonds. War bonds started to be sold in 1940, and there were 3 series that were sold. They were sold in Series E, Series F, and Series G. And for example, with the Series E bond, you could buy a Series E bond for $18.75, and over 10 years' time, it would be equal to $25. So you were giving the government, loaning them $18.25 at the time, and the government's going to pay you back that $18.25 plus the additional $6.25 in interest over the course of 10 years. Now, again, this is coming out of the Depression. People might not have been able to afford to buy an $18.95 bond. So what the government did was, if you could not afford a whole bond, you could buy coupons starting at 10 cents, and you could keep buying these coupons, and you collect them in an album until you were able to finance a whole bond. So there's a way of kind of incrementally earning or buying a bond and helping to support the war efforts. And these war bond efforts were done through ads, drives, and big rallies to help support the purchase. So there were 4 bond waves that were sold, that were put forth to the American people. Each time there would be big public events, big public drives to get people to participate in the war efforts. One of the forms of doing that were these posters that were all over the country. So you see this 85 million Americans hold war bonds. And look at that analogy here: the Statue of Liberty holding her flame of freedom out for the world, and the American investor holding those dollars, again doing his part to preserve liberty in our country. Another one is, here's the soldier doing all you can, brother, buy war bonds. So we've got soldiers in the field who are bleeding, who are suffering in the battlefields of Europe or the battlefields of the Pacific. What can you do on the home front? You can buy war bonds and support them by doing so. So over the course of the war, 85 million Americans purchased bonds, totaled approximately $185 billion. And you can see some more images of war bonds. Is he your child? You don't want this. So, you know, the little happy kid here with that Nazi helmet on his head or Nazi hat on his head. So you don't want this. We have to buy the war bonds before it becomes too late. And not to just only have the Germans be the bad guys, of course, we have to have the Japanese be part of it there. Keep this horror from your home, invest 10% in war bonds, and back up our battle skies. So again, we prevent the Japanese marauders from coming in and ravaging our country and destroying our nation. So Americans rallied to show their support for those fighting in the war efforts. We're going to kind of focus our attention on that. We'll come back to some other ways that we did this. And one of the visible ways was doing this was through the banners that were displayed in windows. So there were blue star banners that symbolized how many sons you had, or maybe even women serving in the WACs of the waves. So if you had one blue star, you would have one son or daughter, two would be two, or three would be three. And so those banners would hang in windows again to show that you had sons who were fighting in the war efforts. For too many families, regrettably though, those blue stars would turn to gold stars when their sons died. So you would have, you know, here this symbolizes a family that lost two of their sons while fighting a war. We're going to talk about the Sullivan brothers in some more detail tomorrow, but so one of the ways that this does this is through the United Service Organization here, the USO. So the USO was founded in 1941, and it still exists in 2022 in providing services to the armed forces. And what do they largely provide? They provide live entertainment. So they'll sponsor comedians, they'll sponsor actors, they'll sponsor musicians to travel to military bases abroad to entertain the troops and their families. So it's a way of bringing some of the comfort and familiarity of American way of life home to our fighting men and women abroad. And they did this through centers to offer dances, and they did this to show movies as well as quiet places to write a letter or to spend time alone. So sometimes you just needed to have quiet time, and the USO centers would do that. As I said before, the camp shows offered entertainment, and the entertainment was the popular comedians of the day. So Laurel and Hardy would perform in USO shows. They're a comedian team. Bing Crosby, who sang White Christmas, the world's most recorded Christmas song, or world's most recorded song ever, Bing Crosby would go and travel. Bob Hope, who was a famous comedian, and he was best known for these USO shows. Bob Hope did all kinds of shows starting in World War II, continuing all the way up until the Persian Gulf War. Mickey Rooney was a childhood actor in the early 1900s, who again was known for his comedy. He teamed up with Shirley Temple in several movies and was a very popular actor at the time. Andrews Sisters were a singing triplet group of women that would do, you know, kind of the doo-wop songs. Mr. Sandman was one of their songs, I believe. Three Coins in a Fountain, but they were very popular, good-looking women, so they would help provide, again, that relief and support from home. Judy Garland, the actress who starred in The Wizard of Oz, and Marlene Dietrich, that we'll talk a little bit more about her tomorrow and her story because it's kind of interesting, and the role that Marlene Dietrich played during the course of the war. So how is the United States Army structured? There were 91 divisions that were mobilized during the course of time, and each division had about 15,000 troops. So they organized them by divisions, 15,000 troops per division, and they were sent abroad. The divisions were divided into 5 large groups. There were 68 infantry divisions, meaning kind of the grunts that would go and just storm the beaches or storm the troops or storm the barricades to go and take land. And you see 2 symbols of the 7th Division and the 8th Division there. There was 1 mountain division. There were 16 armored divisions, so the tanks and the artillery. 5 airborne, so the jumping out of the airplanes. The 101st Division there, you see their logo there. The 101st Airborne is still in existence today and providing often the first wave of the United States movement into foreign territory. And there were 2 cavalry divisions, so even, yes, mounted horses and that kind of movement to move quickly. So all told, that was the Army structure. Looking at the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Navy had 8 fleets, and each fleet had a different area of operation. So you could see in the graphic here, this would have been the commander of the United States Pacific fleets. They would have had command there. And the fleets consisted of various ships. There were aircraft carriers, destroyers, battleships, cruisers, submarines, and support ships. So each one of those, that combination would make a fleet, and there were 8 of those that were active during the course of the Second World War. Now we can ask about the Air Force. Where were they? The Air Force was part of the Army, as the United States Army Air Force. So they're included in there with the Airborne Division. The Air Force wasn't split off as its own separate branch until after World War II. The Marines are considered still part of the Navy, as they are traditionally regarded as the Navy's ground troops. Again, the Navy provides the transportation and provides the bombardment from the distance, provides some of the air support there. They don't actually typically go in on the ground. The Marines will do that, as they're considered traditionally the ground troops of the Navy. And the Coast Guard then also provided support and protective duties. So the next slide here, the next slide shows just the growth of the armed forces of the United States personnel during the course of the Second World War, and just that huge growth that takes place. So the Army in 1939 had just simply less than 200,000 people in the active armed forces, about 125 in the Navy, and 19,000 in the Marines, for a total of just over 334 million troops, a total in 1939. Doesn't grow all that much in 1940 with preparedness then, as we're trying to get there. It does start to grow significantly, though, in 1941 as some of the preparedness drives increases. But then again, that impact of Pearl Harbor. The Army doubles in size from 1940. I'm sorry, Army, Navy, and Marines double in size from 1.8 million to 319 million. And again, that doubling that takes between 42 and 43, when the draft goes into effect, when the recruitment centers are built, and the training all goes into effect, again, it almost triples in size in terms of the total armed forces in operation. And then it levels off finally at about 12.2 million people in the armed forces. But look at that growth from 190,000 troops to almost 8.3 million in just the span of 6 years. That's an astronomical amount of growth in the course of the armed forces at the time. Let's talk about what life would have been like if you were in the armed forces there. So 38% of the people who served in the armed forces were volunteers. The rest were draftees. So there were about a little bit more than a third of the people who served in the Army went in as our Navy or Coast Guard or Marines went in as volunteers. The rest served because they were drafted. The average duration of service, that should say average duration of service, not after duration. I apologize for that. That should say average duration of service was about 33 months, so just short of 3 years. 73% of those who served in the armed forces were sent overseas, with an average of 16 months being served overseas there. And 38% of enlisted personnel had rear echelon non-combat jobs in administrative support or manual labor. So about 40% of those who were enlisted remained either stateside or were sent abroad, but they actually did not go into combat roles. They were providing transportation, they were providing logistics, they were providing the efforts that were needed to serve the Army and Navy or the Air Force in their active roles. Talking about how people would have survived. So out of every 1,000 people, how many people would have survived? 8.6 were killed in action. 3 died from other causes, so probably from diseases or other issues there. And 17.7 people out of 1,000 would have received non-fatal combat wounds. So again, there was a great deal of death. There was a great deal of casualties there. An average base pay for the people, the enlisted man would have received $71.33 a month. Using 1943 just kind of as a base year, that would be about close to $1,200 today. And if you were an officer, you would have made $203.50 a month. And again, using that 1943 as a basis, about $3,300 a month in pay. So it wasn't a huge, well-paying job to serve in the armed forces, and certainly at the risk that was there. But a lot of brave men and women were willing to put themselves in the line to preserve our freedom and the world's freedom. All right, so tomorrow what we're going to cover is we're going to go back and kind of circle to some of the ways that war drive bonds were there. We're going to look at some advertising that was done, some media things that were done, and then talk about a couple of the stories of how this impacted it, so that by Monday we will be able to get into combat operations in the Pacific Theater in 1941 and 42. So thank you, and have a good rest of your day.